Nick Garrett had lived for 76 years on the same patch of Arkansas soil, nestled beside Black Creek. The land had never made him rich, but it had sustained him, and more importantly, it had connected him to a lineage that stretched back nearly a century. 47 acres of quiet crops and fruit trees, rusting tools, and familiar rhythms. The land remembered every boot print of his father, every prayer his mother whispered into the cotton-pink morning fog. After Eleanor died, the silence became thick. Without her voice, the days folded into one another. Each morning brought the same rituals: a pot of thin oatmeal, the clink of a ceramic mug, and the steady shuffle to the barn with the same blue thermos he had carried for decades. He still sat 2 places at the table out of habit. The chair across from his own remained untouched, its wooden arms smoothed by Eleanor's hands over the years. His grief was not loud, but it was constant, like a draft sneaking through a cracked window. Eleanor had been the one who handled the paperwork. Bills, tax documents, registration forms, they were part of her world, one she had guarded quietly with the same care she gave her garden. After she was gone, the letters piled up, unopened, near the stove. At first, Nick couldn't bear to touch them. Later, he simply forgot. One day, in the chilled light of early autumn, a stranger at the gas station recognized Nick's name from the local paper. That was how he discovered that his land was scheduled for auction. The notice, printed under bold letters, listed the parcel number like it was any other piece of forgotten property. The soil where he had buried his dog, the trees he and Eleanor had planted together, reduced to a line of code and a public date. Nick did not raise his voice, write a letter, or call the county office. He returned home, walked to the shed, and began sorting through his life. He sold the tractor he had repaired more times than he could count. He parted with the heirloom apple seeds his grandfather once stored in old mason jars. He gave up his canoe, his collection of preserved harvest jars, his spare generator. Piece by piece, his past turned into currency. By the end of the week, he had $15,200 in cash. Every bill was clean, folded, counted twice. He placed them all into a small wooden box that once held Eleanor's quilting needles. There were no illusions about this gesture. It wasn't about saving a legacy for applause. It was about fulfilling the quiet promise he had made to Eleanor at her bedside, that he would keep their land breathing as long as he could. The auction took place on a Saturday, woven into the town's autumn market. The smell of roasted corn drifted through the square. Handmade crafts, pumpkin displays, children with painted faces, all stood in contrast to the quiet weight in Nick's chest. He arrived early, dressed in the brown coat Eleanor had always said made him look dignified. The wooden box was tucked under his arm, pressed tightly to his side. At the registration tent, the process was impersonal. The young man behind the counter wore a bright red jacket and held a tablet instead of a clipboard. To him, Nick's history was a parcel number, nothing more. When Nick placed the wooden box on the table and opened it, revealing the cash he had gathered, the young man barely glanced at it before gesturing to security. Nick was told that cash was no longer accepted. New county regulations demanded certified checks or digital transfers. The money, honest and hard-earned, meant nothing in the eyes of policy. Whispers stirred in the crowd as a guard gently placed a hand on his arm. The wooden box was taken. Nick didn't protest. He simply turned and walked away through a sea of market sounds, laughter, music, frying dough, as if the world around him no longer needed to include him in it. The old man who had once fought soil and season now found himself pushed out by systems he didn't understand. He reached the edge of the square with empty hands. Somewhere behind him, the land that had held generations waited in silence, unsure if it would still belong to the man who loved it. The weight of failure pressed down heavier than the wooden box he no longer carried. As Nick walked along the gravel shoulder of the road away from the market, each step felt like an admission that he had come with hope and returned with nothing. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of kettle corn and burning leaves, but for him, it might as well have been smoke from a house burned to the ground. He didn't return home immediately. Instead, he walked the long loop around town, avoiding familiar faces. The autumn sky was high and unforgiving, blue like glass. Somewhere behind him, the auction was beginning. Parcel after parcel, numbers and names, none of which could be spoken with love the way he had once whispered to the trees on frostbitten mornings. By the time he reached the edge of his own gravel driveway, the sun was beginning to lower, throwing golden light across the ridges of the barn roof. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like home. But all Nick could feel was the dull ache of a man who had been deemed unnecessary by a system that promised to protect his rights while ignoring his life. That night, he boiled a few potatoes and poured the last of the tomato preserves into a chipped bowl. He ate in silence. Across from him, Eleanor's place remained untouched, her cup clean, her chair dusted. The ache in his chest wasn't from hunger, but from helplessness. When he lay down, he didn't sleep. The walls creaked like whispers, and the sound of crickets outside reminded him that even nature carried on without his permission. But not everyone had moved on. A letter, written weeks earlier with hand still steady and words still plain, had found its way beyond Elm Hill. Nick hadn't sent it in protest. It wasn't a demand, nor a petition. It had simply been a story. A farmer's story. His story. Folded into an envelope and mailed in a moment of quiet, not to a local office, but to an address printed on a postcard his wife once kept in the drawer marked Hope. It had made its way onto Air Force One, carried not by urgency but by sincerity. Among the staff who sorted letters sent to the president, one aide read it twice. The letter didn't ask for money or recognition. It told of land loved deeply, of mistakes made in grief, of quiet dignity lost in bureaucratic blind spots. Something in it rang true, like the hum of a forgotten hymn. On the morning of the auction, even as Nick walked into rejection, the machinery of federal attention had already begged in to move. Security teams were dispatched. A detour was planned. What had been a visit to a nearby university took a different turn. In Elm Hill, as the bidding began for parcel 2043B, the sound of engines interrupted the cheerful rhythm of the market. The first black SUV arrived quietly, followed by two more, and then the unmistakable glint of official motorcycles flanking the procession. People turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The auctioneer's voice faltered. From the center vehicle stepped a figure in dark slacks and a navy jacket. Surrounded by security, the President of the United States stepped into the autumn sunlight, eyes focused, expression unreadable. The market, until then filled with candy apples and soft country tunes, fell into a stunned silence. Vendors froze mid-sale. Children stopped mid-laugh. The man didn't pause. He moved through the crowd toward the auction tent, briefcase in hand, flanked by aides and agents. The young organizer in the red coat paled. Whispers surged like a tide. Nick, still walking along the edge of his fields, unaware of the gathering storm behind him, felt only the familiar crunch of dried leaves under his boots. He did not know that his story had shifted something far larger than a policy. He did not know that those who had dismissed him were now standing in stillness, eyes wide, hearts unsure. Within minutes, federal documentation was presented. The auction of Garrett Farm was immediately suspended. Compliance officers took statements. The cash Nick had brought, seized and ignored, was documented, verified, and quietly returned to the market tent, placed carefully back into the wooden box by a gloved hand. As the president stepped to the microphone hastily set up at the heart of the square, his remarks were brief but heavy. Mistakes had been made. Investigations were pending. Above all, he noted, a nation's strength could not exist without its silent stewards, the ones who asked for nothing but dignity. The press had been tipped. Cameras were already filming. In that moment, with corn stalks swaying in the background and rows of silent onlookers bearing witness, the story of a forgotten farmer was no longer just his own. It had become something larger. A question about what mattered, and to whom. Nick, still walking, had yet to know that his farm had been saved. Nick reached his porch as the first orange streaks of sunset crossed the hills. The wind stirred the thin curtains inside his kitchen window. It was the same quiet place he had returned to every evening for decades. But now, something was missing. Not just the money or the dignity taken earlier that day, but the sense that he still belonged. As twilight settled on the Garrett farm, Nick sat alone on the top step, elbows resting on his knees, his hands motionless. He remained there long after the stars came out. In town, the story moved faster than any gossip Elm Hill had ever known. Word spread before phones could finish ringing. The president had walked through the market, had stood beneath the banner strung between the cider booth and the auctioneer's tent. Some said he spoke with fire in his voice, others swore he barely raised it. But everyone agreed, everything stopped the moment he arrived. The news stations ran it first as a side note, something strange from a quiet place. But by midnight, the footage had gone viral. One shaky clip from a vendor's phone showed Nick being turned away, the wooden box in his hands, the cash dismissed. The second clip showed the arrival of the presidential convoy. The contrast between those moments struck a nerve in people far beyond Arkansas. In cities across the country, people watched a farmer in an old coat be humiliated over a rule that made no room for grief. And then they saw the leader of the nation halt a public auction to speak for someone who had never asked for help. Something about it felt different, less political, more human. Talk show hosts discussed it. Columnists wrote about the dignity of the forgotten. Memes appeared, but so did serious questions about land rights, bureaucracy, and rural neglect. For one night, America paused to consider a man who had never tried to be noticed. The next morning, as Nick poured coffee into a ceramic mug that had belonged to Eleanor, he turned on the small radio in the kitchen. The announcer's voice spoke of investigations, of property sales frozen across the state, of an emergency session convened by the governor. Nick stood very still, the cup hovering just above the counter. He heard his name. Not shouted or cheered, but spoken carefully, like it mattered. Within hours, county officials arrived at his gate. There were no news cameras. No fanfare. Just 2 plain sedans and 3 officials in dark jackets. They walked the gravel path respectfully, their voices low, their tone professional. Nick met them at the gate, hat in hand. The conversation was brief. They handed him a document, an official stay of auction and property seizure. It was signed not only by a federal official but also the state treasurer. It explained that the tax delinquency had stemmed from a clerical error, compounded by outdated estate transfer filings. In short, the seizure was invalid. The land would remain his. Nick listened quietly, then nodded. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from something harder to name. The officials shook his hand before returning to their cars. They left no pamphlets, no warnings, only a clear message that the government had made a mistake, and it was being corrected. He returned to the house and sat again on the porch step. The wind had changed. It came now from the west, soft and clean, carrying the faint scent of apple bark and turned soil. He did not cry. He did not laugh. But his shoulders, long held stiff with invisible weight, eased just slightly. Later that week, a white envelope arrived in the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive. Inside was a single sheet of high-grade stationery, unsigned. The note explained that repairs had already begun on the barn roof. An irrigation system, long broken, was being restored. His seed supply would be replenished. The letter ended with a brief sentence, almost too simple for what it meant: "Thank you for what you gave us when we had nothing." The signature was not a name, only an initial. But the letter included a photograph, folded once in half, a small girl holding a bushel of apples, smiling beside a younger Eleanor. On the back was a date, July 1983. Nick understood. Sometimes, what leaves a hand in one decade returns from another. The seeds he and Eleanor had given away during that dry summer had grown, just not in soil he could see. And now, they had returned, not as charity, but as repayment. Silent, exact, and just. The repairs arrived piece by piece. Workers, always quiet, always efficient, came and went with trucks and ladders. They never asked for anything. The barn regained its shape. The house received new gutters. The irrigation ditches along the back pasture, once dry and cracked, flowed again. Neighbors began to stop by, not with questions, but with pies, with toolboxes, with hands ready to help. The young couple from the southern fence line brought paint. A retired schoolteacher offered to inventory the apple varieties still surviving. Nick didn't lead them. He simply welcomed them. The land, once isolated, began to pulse again. There was no ceremony. No parade. But something had shifted. Not just in Nick, but in Elm Hill. In the months that followed, Garrett Farm transformed in quiet ways. The changes were not flashy. There were no developers, no marketing banners, no influx of tourists. But something had taken root, something stronger than attention. Interest had given way to investment, and investment to care. It began with a letter from the local school district. They asked permission to bring students out once a week to learn about heritage farming. Not industrial-scale agriculture, but the kind passed down from calloused hands and sun-worn memory. Nick agreed without hesitation. He cleaned the tool shed. He mended the fence posts. He walked the fields in the early mornings, naming each tree under his breath, the way Eleanor once did. The children arrived in yellow buses that rattled down the gravel lane. They spilled out with notebooks and questions. Nick didn't lecture. He showed them. He dug into the earth and let them feel it. He cracked open seed pods and handed them over like heirlooms. He showed them how to graft an apple branch, how to find a swallow's nest under the rafters of the barn. Their voices echoed across the pastures, full of curiosity he thought had vanished from the world. Teachers stayed behind to take notes. Some returned on weekends, bringing spouses and friends. A biology professor from the university an hour north asked to document the old apple varieties, several of which were thought to be extinct. He found 3 that had no match in the state archive. A petition began to preserve them officially as part of Arkansas's agricultural history. Word spread, but not like it had before. This time, it spread slowly, intentionally, like roots moving beneath the surface. Donations arrived, unsolicited but always discreet. A solar company offered panels for the roof. A retired mason repaired the crumbling stone well. Volunteers replanted native grasses along the banks of Black Creek. They didn't ask for news coverage. They asked for seeds and soil and time. At the entrance to the property, a sign appeared one morning. It hadn't been ordered or installed by the county. A local woodworker had carved it by hand. Garrett Farm, established 1928, reclaimed 2023. The letters were bold, but the wood was aged, sanded smooth by hands that understood both reverence and craftsmanship. Nick stood before it for a long time that morning, running his fingers over each groove. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like part of something still unfolding. When winter arrived, it did so gently. The cold was sharp, but the farm was ready. The apple trees had been pruned. The irrigation lines insulated. Inside the farmhouse, the wood stove burned steadily. On the mantel above it sat the folded flag from Nick's service, a picture of Eleanor, and the small wooden box that had once carried every penny he had left. It was empty now, but full in other ways. It had become a symbol. A reminder that dignity carried to the very end could still return with interest. Nick kept a new journal now. Not of debts or crop yields, but of visitors. He wrote down the names of the students who planted seedlings. He noted the date a doe gave birth near the lower pasture. He recorded the kind of kindness that left no invoice, like the young man who repaired the broken mailbox because his grandfather used to work for the Garretts during summer harvests. One entry stood alone, circled in pencil. The land always remembered us. We just forgot how to listen. By spring, the state had included Garrett Farm in its list of cultural heritage sites. School buses came more frequently. A group of veterans visited one weekend, walking the rows slowly, pausing to touch the bark, to feel the air. One of them, silent, one leg replaced with steel, left a single bronze star on the porch. No note. Just the metal. Nick didn't keep it. He mounted it above the new barn door beside a plaque that read simply, "For those who endure with grace." He never tried to explain his story. Others did that now. Articles were written. A segment aired on a national news broadcast. But Nick kept to the soil. He rose early. He checked the compost bins. He walked the fence lines and greeted the returning birds. He poured 2 cups of coffee each morning, one for him and one for the memory that still warmed the kitchen. The farm was no longer just his. It had become a place that held pieces of many lives, past and present. He did not mind sharing it. In fact, it seemed to give it breath again. People came not for spectacle, but for stillness. They came to remember what mattered. What had always mattered. The man who had once stood humiliated at a market tent now stood as a quiet testament to something larger than justice. A reminder that even in a noisy, hurried world, quiet kindness still held power. That the soil, if tended with care and humility, could still grow more than food. It could grow memory. It could grow meaning. It could grow legacy. And in the end, Nick had kept his promise. Not to an audience, or to a court, but to the woman he loved, and to the land that never stopped waiting for him.